Most people think the mansions of the Gilded Age died because they were too extravagant to survive the modern city, but one house on Prairie Avenue tells a harsher truth. In 1883, this mansion rose with carved stone, imported wood, and a bank president's certainty that wealth could make anything permanent. Today, it still stands while every neighboring palace is gone. That survival was not grace or luck. It was adaptation. Inside these walls, fortunes collapsed, operating tables replaced ballrooms, and usefulness became the price of survival. The question is not why this house endured, but what it had to become. A palace built against oblivion. Prairie Avenue glittered with wealth, but this house was built by a man terrified of ever being powerless again. His name was John Borden Nickerson. The fire had taught him everything he needed to know about permanence. In 1871, he stood on the shore of Lake Michigan and watched Chicago burn for 3 days straight. The flames took 65 blocks. They consumed 17,000 buildings. When the smoke cleared, 300 people were dead and 100,000 were homeless. Nickerson survived, but survival was not the same as safety. He rebuilt. Most men would have called that enough. Nickerson called it a beginning. By 1883, he had become president of the First National Bank of Chicago. His wealth was not old money passed down through generations. It was new money scraped together through speculation and nerve. That kind of fortune feels different in your hands. It feels temporary. So Nickerson decided to build something that could not burn, could not collapse, could not be erased by accident or malice or the indifference of time. He chose Prairie Avenue because that was where power lived. The street stretched south from downtown, lined with limestone and ambition. George Pullman built there. Marshall Field built there. Philip Armour, the meatpacking king, claimed an entire block. By the early 1880s, Prairie Avenue held more millionaires per acre than any other street in America. The combined wealth on that single mile of cobblestones exceeded $200 million. The mansions rose shoulder to shoulder, each one trying to outdeclare the others. Nickerson hired Solon Spencer Beeman, the same architect who designed Pullman's palace. He wanted something that would last 1,000 years. The instructions were simple. Use stone that would not crack. Use wood that would not rot. Build walls thick enough to survive another fire, another panic, another collapse of everything he thought was stable. The foundation went down 8 feet into Chicago clay. The exterior walls rose 3 feet thick at the base, built from Joliet limestone that had formed at the bottom of ancient seas. The stone came from quarries 40 miles southwest of the city, each block cut to exact dimensions and hauled by rail. The mansion consumed over 600 tons of limestone before the walls reached their full height. Inside, the wood told a different story. Nickerson imported mahogany from Honduras, cherry from Appalachia, oak from forests that had stood for centuries. The main staircase alone required 4 months of carving. Every newel post, every baluster, every panel was shaped by hand. The craftsmen were German and Irish, brought to Chicago specifically for this project. They worked in silence, measuring twice, cutting once, because mistakes were not tolerated. The mansion covered nearly 9,000 square feet across 3 stories. 15 rooms on the main floors, servants' quarters tucked into the attic, kitchens and storage carved into the basement. The ceiling soared 14 feet high on the first floor, giving each room the proportions of a cathedral. Windows stretched from floor to near ceiling, flooding the interior with light that caught on crystal chandeliers imported from France. But the details reveal the real purpose. The front doors were solid oak, 4 inches thick, mounted on hinges designed for bank vaults. The windows had iron shutters concealed in the walls, ready to seal the house against flames or riots or whatever chaos the city might birth. The roof used slate instead of wooden shingles, each piece overlapping to shed water and sparks. Even the landscaping served a defensive purpose. The yard stretched 60 feet from the street to the front steps, creating a buffer zone between the mansion and the unpredictable world beyond. Nickerson was building a fortress that looked like a palace. The total cost reached $150,000, equivalent to roughly $4.5 million today. That figure included everything from foundation to furniture, from the limestone blocks to the silk wallpaper in the drawing room. For Nickerson, the expense was not extravagance. It was insurance. Every dollar spent was a dollar invested in permanence, in the illusion that enough money could purchase safety from disaster. The mansion took 2 years to complete. When it finally opened in 1885, Nickerson stood in the entrance hall and believed he had won. The house felt solid, immovable, eternal. He had built something the fire could not touch, something the city could not erase, something that would stand as proof that John Borden Nickerson had existed and mattered. But the house was never about beauty. It was about fear. And fear, as it turned out, was a better foundation than he knew. When survival became obsession, every carved panel and imported stone concealed a private fear that money could vanish as quickly as flames. Nickerson understood something most of his neighbors did not. Wealth in the Gilded Age was not a solid thing. It was a current, always moving, always threatening to shift direction and leave you stranded. He had watched fortunes collapse overnight during the Panic of 1873. He had seen men who owned railroads begging for loans by the end of the decade. The fire had burned buildings. Financial panic burned lives. So he built redundancy into everything. The mansion's heating system used 3 separate furnaces in the basement, each one capable of warming the entire house. If one failed, the others would compensate. The gas lighting had backup oil lamps in every room, ready to ignite if the city's gas supply faltered. The kitchen maintained 2 full sets of cookware, 2 sets of dishes, 2 of everything that might break or wear out. Nickerson was preparing for a siege that might never come. His banking practices followed the same logic. First National held reserves far beyond what regulators required. Where other banks kept 10% of deposits in cash, Nickerson kept 20%. Where competitors made aggressive loans to railroad speculators and real estate developers, he favored conservative investments in government bonds and established manufacturing. His colleagues called him overcautious. His balance sheets called him paranoid. They were both correct. The mansion functioned as a physical manifestation of that paranoia. The basement contained storage rooms stocked with 6 months of coal, enough candles to light the house through a year of darkness, preserved foods in quantities that would feed a small army. The attic held trunks filled with extra linens, spare furniture, replacement parts for everything from door hinges to window locks. If the city collapsed again, if the banks failed again, if everything went wrong simultaneously, the Nickerson Mansion could seal itself off and survive. But the psychological cost of that preparation was exhausting. Nickerson's personal ledgers, preserved in the Chicago History Museum, reveal a man obsessed with tracking every expense. He recorded the cost of coal down to the individual bucket. He noted the price of eggs, butter, flour, candles. Every servant's wage appeared in meticulous columns, updated weekly, cross-referenced against household accounts. The ledgers fill 32 volumes covering the period from 1885 to 1890. That is roughly 1,500 pages of handwritten financial anxiety. His wife, Matilda, left fewer records. The fragments that survive suggest a woman trying to create warmth in a house designed for endurance. She hosted dinners and musicales, filled the rooms with flowers and laughter, invited Prairie Avenue society to admire the carved staircases and imported silk. But beneath the social performance, she understood what the mansion really represented. In a letter to her sister, written in 1887, she described the house as beautiful but cold, elegant but somehow empty. She was describing her husband's heart. Nickerson had survived the fire by leaving the city ahead of the flames. While others fought to save their homes, he took his family and fled south. They spent 3 days in a hotel in Hyde Park, watching the smoke rise over the downtown. When he returned, his business was gone, but he was alive. That choice to run rather than fight left a mark. He had saved himself by abandoning everything, and some part of him never forgave that cowardice. The mansion was penance. It was proof he would never run again. The house consumed resources at a staggering rate. Coal for the furnaces cost between $1,200 and $1,500 per year. Servants' wages totaled another $3,000. Maintenance and repairs added $1,200 more. Gas, water, property taxes, insurance, and miscellaneous expenses pushed the annual operating cost to nearly $8,000. That was roughly $240,000 in modern terms every single year, just to keep the doors open and the lights burning. Nickerson could afford it. First National was thriving. Chicago was growing faster than any city in American history. The population had doubled since the fire, from 300,000 to 600,000 souls. Money flowed through the banks like water through the Chicago River, and Nickerson stood at the center of that current, collecting his percentage of every transaction. But the fear never left him. He began adding to the mansion almost immediately. New rooms appeared in the basement. The attic expanded. A greenhouse sprouted from the western wall, creating a controlled environment where Matilda could grow orchids and roses regardless of Chicago's brutal winters. Each addition served a purpose. Each new space filled a perceived gap in the mansion's defenses. The house kept growing because Nickerson could not stop improving its chances of survival. By 1890, the mansion had become a monument to preparedness. It stood on Prairie Avenue like a cathedral of caution, its limestone walls thick enough to withstand cannon fire, its systems layered and redundant and exhaustively maintained. Nickerson walked its halls every evening, checking locks and testing shutters, making certain everything was ready for the disaster he knew was coming. He just never imagined the disaster would come from inside his own balance sheet. The dream that finally felt safe. By the late 1880s, the mansion stood complete, and for a brief moment, it seemed invincible. Prairie Avenue had reached its apex. The street glowed with gaslight and ambition. Every evening, carriages lined the cobblestones, delivering Chicago's elite to dinners and balls that lasted until dawn. The Nickerson Mansion joined that rotation, its doors opening to reveal interiors that made even jaded millionaires pause and stare. The entrance hall stretched 40 feet from the front door to the base of the grand staircase. The floor was laid with alternating squares of white marble and black walnut, creating a chessboard effect that drew the eye upward toward the carved ceiling. Gas chandeliers hung at intervals, their crystal prisms catching light and scattering it into rainbow fragments across the walls. The effect was calculated. Visitors were meant to feel small, humbled by the scale and craftsmanship surrounding them. Beyond the hall, the mansion unfolded into a series of formal rooms, each one designed for a specific social function. The drawing room held silk furniture and paintings in gilt frames. The library contained over 2,000 volumes, their leather spines arranged by subject and size. The dining room seated 24 guests beneath a ceiling, painted to resemble the night sky, complete with constellations rendered in gold leaf. But the ballroom was the masterpiece. It occupied the entire eastern wing of the second floor, stretching 60 feet long and 30 feet wide. The ceiling soared 18 feet overhead, supported by columns wrapped in polished mahogany. 3 massive chandeliers hung in a line down the center, each one holding 48 candles that transformed the room into a cavern of flickering light. The floor was maple, specially treated to provide the perfect surface for dancing. The walls were covered in crimson silk, imported from Lyon at a cost of $12 per yard. When filled with people, the ballroom became something close to magic. Orchestras played from a raised platform at the northern end. Couples waltzed across the maple floor while servants circulated with champagne and oysters. The air smelled of perfume, cigar smoke, and ambition. These were the people who controlled Chicago: railroad barons and grain speculators, meat-packing magnates and department store kings. They gathered in Nickerson's ballroom because being invited meant you mattered. The social calendar consumed Matilda's energy. She hosted dinners every Thursday, musicales every second Tuesday, and at least 2 grand balls each winter season. The guest lists were strategic. Pullman had to be invited but seated far from the Armours, who had feuded with him over labor practices. The fields required the best wine and the most attentive service. Every event was a performance, every detail mattered, every mistake could echo through Prairie Avenue society for months. The cost of maintaining that social position was immense. A single ball might consume $500 in flowers, food, wine, and entertainment. Matilda's wardrobe required constant updating to match the latest fashions from Paris and New York. The servants needed special training to handle formal events without embarrassing the household. The mansion's reputation depended on perfection, and perfection was expensive. But for a few years, it worked. The Nickersons became fixtures in Chicago society. Their names appeared regularly in newspaper columns describing the city's most important gatherings. Architects published sketches of the mansion in trade journals, praising its blend of Romanesque and Victorian styles. Tour guides began pointing out the house to visitors, identifying it as one of Prairie Avenue's crown jewels. Nickerson allowed himself to relax slightly. The ledgers from 1889 and 1890 show fewer obsessive annotations, fewer midnight calculations of coal reserves and food stocks. He began to believe that the mansion had achieved its purpose. It had made him permanent. It had transformed him from a fire survivor into a pillar of Chicago society. The house was working. The summer of 1890 was particularly kind. Chicago's economy was booming. First National's assets had grown to over $15 million, making it one of the largest banks in the Midwest. Nickerson's personal wealth approached $2 million, enough to support the mansion's expenses indefinitely. The house parties continued through June and July. The greenhouse produced spectacular roses, and Matilda began planning the most ambitious ball Prairie Avenue had ever seen. It was scheduled for October 18th, 1890. 200 guests, 4 orchestras, champagne from France, lobster from Maine, ice, sculptures carved to resemble the mansion itself. The invitations went out in late August, engraved on cream stock with gold edging. The RSVPs came back positive. Everyone who mattered would attend. The mansion prepared itself like a living thing getting ready for battle. Servants scrubbed every surface. Florists filled every room with orchids and roses. The kitchen staff worked 18-hour days, preparing food that could be served cold if the timing faltered. The ballroom chandeliers were lowered and every crystal prism polished until it gleamed. The maple floor received a fresh coat of wax. October 18th arrived clear and cold. The mansion glowed from within, every window blazing with gaslight. Carriages began arriving at 7 in the evening, disgorging women in silk and men in formal black. The ballroom filled with music and laughter. Champagne flowed. The ice sculptures held their shape. Everything was perfect. Nickerson stood near the entrance to the ballroom, greeting guests, accepting compliments on his magnificent home. For the first time since the fire, he felt safe. The mansion had proven itself. It had survived its first decade, established its reputation, become exactly what he had intended it to be. The illusion lasted until November. When the numbers stopped making sense behind closed doors, the accounts no longer balanced, even as the chandeliers kept glowing. The panic began in Europe. Baring Brothers, one of London's oldest merchant banks, collapsed in November 1890 after overextending itself in Argentine railway bonds. The failure sent shockwaves through international finance. British investors panicked and began withdrawing capital from American ventures. That capital had been flowing into railroads, factories, and real estate developments across the United States. When it stopped, the consequences rippled outward like cracks in ice. Chicago felt it immediately. The city's growth had been fueled by borrowed money, by British, and Eastern capital seeking higher returns than were available in more established markets. Railroad construction slowed. Real estate development stalled. Factories began laying off workers. By early 1891, the optimism of the previous decade had curdled into something darker. First National should have been insulated. Nickerson's conservative practices meant the bank held substantial reserves and avoided the most speculative investments. But conservative did not mean invulnerable. The bank's loan portfolio included advances to grain merchants, meat packers, and manufacturers, all of whom were suffering as credit tightened and markets contracted. Defaults began appearing in the monthly reports. Nickerson's personal ledgers from 1891 reveal the moment he understood what was happening. The entries shift from routine tracking to frantic calculation. He began listing loan losses, projecting future defaults, estimating the bank's exposure to various sectors of Chicago's economy. The numbers grew worse each month. By summer, First National had written off over $300,000 in bad loans. That was 2% of the bank's total assets, enough to worry regulators and spook depositors. The mansion's expenses did not decline. Coal still cost $1,500 per year. Servants still required wages totaling $3,000. Maintenance, repairs, taxes, and insurance added another $3,000. The house consumed $8,000 annually, whether the economy thrived or collapsed. That was the trap of permanence. Once you built something that large, you could not easily shrink it to match changing circumstances. Nickerson tried to economize. The Thursday dinners became less frequent. The winter balls were postponed. Matilda dismissed 2 of the household servants, consolidating their duties among the remaining staff. The greenhouse was allowed to go cold, its orchids dying in the Chicago winter. These were small savings, a few $100s clawed back from the mansion's relentless appetite for cash. It was not enough. By 1892, First National's loan losses exceeded $500,000. The bank's capital reserves, once the envy of Chicago's financial community, had eroded to barely adequate levels. Depositors were nervous. Withdrawals increased. Nickerson spent his days reassuring worried customers while his nights were consumed with calculating how long the bank could sustain the hemorrhaging. The ledgers from this period are painful to read. Each entry is written in Nickerson's increasingly shaky hand, the numbers getting smaller, as if he hoped making them physically tiny might reduce their impact. He began selling personal assets to maintain liquidity. Railroad bonds went first, sold at a loss because the market for such securities had evaporated. Then real estate holdings outside Chicago, parcels he had accumulated as safe stores of value. Each sale brought in cash, but represented a permanent loss of wealth. The mansion itself became a target of his calculations. He estimated its value at $120,000, down from the $150,000 it had cost to build. Real estate prices on Prairie Avenue had softened as Chicago's economy stumbled. More concerning, there were no buyers. Who would purchase a mansion requiring $8,000 per year to maintain when money was scarce and the future uncertain? By early 1893, the national economy was in full crisis. The Reading Railroad declared bankruptcy in February. National Cordage Company failed in May. In June, the stock market collapsed. Banks across the country began suspending operations, unable to meet depositor demands. Over 15,000 businesses failed that year. Unemployment reached 20% in industrial cities. The Panic of 1893 had become a full depression. First National survived, but barely. Nickerson imposed strict lending limits and called in every loan that could be recalled. The bank's assets shrank from $15 million to $10 million over the course of 12 months. That contraction saved the institution, but destroyed Nickerson's personal fortune. His wealth, which had peaked at $2 million, fell below $600,000 by the end of 1893. Most of that remaining value was tied up in the mansion itself, which had become impossible to sell. The house felt different during those years. The ballroom stood empty, its chandeliers dark to save gas. Dust accumulated on the silk furniture in the drawing room. The library's 2,000 volumes went unread. Servants moved through the halls like ghosts, maintaining routines but without the energy that comes from prosperity and confidence. The mansion was still beautiful, but beauty without purpose feels hollow. Matilda wrote to her sister in December 1893. The letter described a Thanksgiving dinner attended by only family, no guests, no elaborate preparations. She mentioned selling her jewelry, pieces that had been gifts from Nickerson during better times. The tone was resigned rather than bitter. She understood that the mansion had become a weight around their necks, but she also understood there was no escape. They were trapped by their own monument to permanence. Nickerson's health began failing in 1894. The stress of managing a bank through a depression while watching his personal fortune evaporate took a physical toll. He developed chest pains and shortness of breath. His doctors prescribed rest, but rest was impossible. First National required constant attention, Depositors still needed reassurance. The mansion still demanded its $8,000 per year. By 1895, Nickerson was 62 years old and looked 70. The fire that had driven him to build the mansion had burned out, replaced by exhaustion and the aikotsi, bitter knowledge that all his preparation had not been enough. He had built fortress walls thick enough to survive anything except the invisible currents of capital that had financed the fortress in the first place. The mansion stood solid and immovable, while the wealth that sustained it drained away like water into sand. Every morning, Nickerson walked through rooms that cost a fortune to heat and maintain, knowing that fortune no longer existed. The house had become his prison, and the sentence was life. Death did not end the story. The builder's death should have frozen the house in time, but instead it stripped away its protection. John Borden Nickerson died on March 7, 1897. The official cause was heart failure, but the real cause was simpler. He had run out of strength. The depression had broken him the way the fire never could. At the end, he weighed barely 130 pounds, his body consumed by stress and worry. The funeral was small. Prairie. Avenue's elite attended, but the ceremony lacked the grandeur that had characterized the mansion's peak years. Nickerson was buried in Graceland Cemetery, his grave marked by a modest stone that mentioned his role at First National, but said nothing about the house he had built. That silence was revealing. The mansion had defined his life, but he did not want it defining his death. Matilda inherited everything. That meant the mansion, roughly $400,000 in remaining assets, and control over Nickerson's estate. It also meant responsibility for the $8,000 in annual operating costs, plus mounting maintenance issues that had been deferred during the crisis years. The roof needed slate replaced, the furnaces were wearing out. The limestone exterior had developed cracks from Chicago's freeze-thaw cycles. The house was aging, and aging required money. She tried to maintain the social calendar. Thursday dinners resumed, though on a reduced scale. She hosted a single ball in the winter of 1898, inviting 100 guests instead of 200. The effort was valiant, but ultimately futile. Prairie Avenue Society had noticed Nickerson's financial collapse. They attended out of politeness, not respect. The mansion's reputation had shifted from monument to warning. The real problem was mathematical. Matilda's annual income from investments totaled roughly $20,000. The mansion consumed $8,000 of that, leaving $12,000 for personal expenses, taxes, and the slow accumulation of repairs. That budget would have been comfortable for a widow living in a smaller home. For someone trying to maintain a 15-room mansion designed to impress millionaires, it was impossible. The bills accumulated like snow. Coal deliveries went unpaid for months. Servants accepted delayed wages because finding new positions in a depressed economy was difficult. The tax assessor sent increasingly stern notices about overdue property taxes. Each month, Matilda juggled payments, deciding which creditors could wait and which demanded immediate satisfaction. By 1900, the maintenance issues had become critical. The greenhouse, unheated since 1891, had suffered structural damage from ice and needed complete rebuilding or demolition. The ballroom ceiling showed water stains from a leak in the roof that had gone unrepaired for 3 winters. The main staircase's carved newel posts had developed cracks from the mansion's constant heating and cooling cycles. Every room contained similar problems, each one minor individually, but catastrophic collectively. Matilda began selling the mansion's contents. The paintings went first, auctioned to collectors who valued art more than sentiment. The library's rare volumes followed, purchased by universities and private collectors. Furniture that had cost thousands disappeared piece by piece, replaced by simpler alternatives or not replaced at all. The dining room that had seated 24 now seated 8. The ballroom stood entirely empty, its silk walls faded and its chandeliers dark. The house was devouring itself to survive. Prairie Avenue was changing around the mansion. The Depression had accelerated trends that were already underway. Chicago's wealthy elite began moving north to the Gold Coast, where new mansions offered modern amenities and distance from the industrial smoke that increasingly choked the city's southern neighborhoods. The old palaces on Prairie Avenue started emptying. Some were converted to boarding houses. Others stood vacant, their windows dark, their yards overgrown. The Pullman Mansion, just 2 blocks north, had already been divided into apartments. The Field Mansion was scheduled for demolition to make way for a commercial building. The Armour estate had been sold to a developer who planned to tear it down and build row houses. Prairie Avenue's Millionaire's Row was dying, and the process was brutal. One by one, the monuments to Gilded Age excess were being erased. Matilda watched this happen with mounting horror. She understood that her mansion faced the same fate. Without substantial capital for repairs and modernization, the house would deteriorate beyond saving. Once that happened, demolition would be cheaper than restoration. The mansion that Nickerson built to last 1,000 years might not survive 30. She considered selling, but the market for large mansions had collapsed. Real estate agents politely declined to list the property, explaining that no buyers existed for houses requiring such enormous operating expenses. The few inquiries came from speculators interested only in the land, and their offers assumed demolition costs would be deducted from the purchase price. Selling meant accepting perhaps $30,000 and watching the mansion torn down brick by brick. Matilda refused. The house was her husband's monument, his attempt to achieve permanence. She would not be the one to destroy it. By 1903, she was 71 years old and exhausted. The constant financial juggling had worn her down. She could no longer host even modest dinners. The servants had been reduced to 2. The mansion felt enormous and empty, its rooms echoing with absence. She wrote to her niece that year, describing the house as beautiful but dying, like a garden in autumn. The turning point came in the winter of 1904. A water pipe burst in the basement, flooding the furnace rooms and causing $1,500 in damage. Matilda did not have $1,500. Her income had declined as investments matured and were not replaced. The mansion's operating costs had not declined. The mathematics were brutal and simple. She could no longer afford to live in her own house. That February, she accepted an offer from her daughter and son-in-law. They would move into the mansion, take over the expenses, and allow Matilda to remain in residence. It was charity disguised as family duty, and both parties knew it. But it was also survival. The mansion needed younger energy and fresh capital, even if that capital was modest. The arrangement lasted 2 years. In 1906, Matilda died quietly in her sleep, in the bedroom she had shared with Nickerson for 21 years. She was 74. The cause was listed as pneumonia, but really it was exhaustion. She had fought to preserve the mansion for 9 years after her husband's death, and the effort had consumed her. The mansion passed to her daughter, Eliza. It also passed a problem that had no obvious solution. The house was too expensive to maintain, too distinctive to sell, and too meaningful to demolish. It needed a purpose beyond being a monument to dead ambition. Without that purpose, the mansion would join its neighbors in oblivion. Salvation was coming, but it would arrive wearing a surgical mask. The first reinvention. Nobody wanted salvation arrived not as admiration, but as a proposal that horrified purists and saved the building. The American College of Surgeons needed a headquarters. In 1916, the organization had outgrown its rented offices in downtown Chicago and began searching for a permanent home. The college's mission was to professionalize surgery, establish standards, and transform what had been a craft practiced by barbers and battlefield medics into a recognized medical specialty. That mission required dignity, space, and a building that projected authority. Franklin Martin, the college's founder, had specific requirements. The headquarters needed public rooms for meetings and conferences, library space for medical texts and journals, offices for administrators, and ideally, some connection to Chicago's cultural prestige. He toured several buildings. Most were modern commercial structures lacking character. Others were old mansions too far gone to salvage. Then he saw the Nickerson Mansion. The house had been empty for 3 years. Eliza Nickerson had tried to maintain it after her mother's death, but the costs proved impossible. By 1913, she had moved out entirely, leaving the mansion to deteriorate while she searched desperately for a buyer. The search had been futile. No individual wanted a white elephant, and no institution seemed interested in a residential palace. Martin walked through the empty rooms in December 1916. The mansion was in poor condition. Water damage marked the ceilings. Dust lay thick on the floors. The heating system had failed years earlier, but the bones were solid. The limestone walls showed no structural cracks. The carved woodwork remained intact. The ballroom's proportions were grand enough for a conference of 300 surgeons. He made an offer. The college would purchase the mansion for $60,000, less than half what Nickerson had spent building it. Eliza accepted immediately, grateful to escape the financial trap before the house collapsed entirely. The sale closed in February 1917. The American College of Surgeons took possession that spring. The announcement generated controversy. Architectural preservationists, a small but vocal group, protested that converting a mansion into offices would destroy its historical character. They demanded the house be maintained exactly as Nickerson had left it, a perfect preservation of Gilded Age domestic life. When informed that such preservation would cost tens of thousands annually with no revenue to support it, they suggested public fundraising. No funds materialized. Franklin Martin was uninterested in preservation for its own sake. He needed a functional headquarters, not a museum. The college hired architects to redesign the interior while maintaining the exterior's appearance. The plans were practical, bordering on brutal. The ballroom would become the assembly hall. The drawing room would be subdivided into offices. The dining room would house the library. The bedrooms would be converted to meeting rooms and administrative spaces. Work began in May 1917. Construction crews moved through the mansion like surgeons through a body, cutting away ornament to expose function. The silk wallpaper came down, revealing plaster that could be painted institutional white. The carved panels were removed where they blocked sight lines or made rooms inefficiently small. The chandeliers disappeared into storage, replaced by electric fixtures that provided better light for reading medical texts. The ballroom transformation was the most dramatic. The crimson silk walls were stripped away. The parquet floor was covered with linoleum that could withstand heavy foot traffic. A stage was built at the northern end for speakers and demonstrations. Rows of chairs replaced the open dance floor. Lighting was installed to accommodate lectures and surgical demonstrations. When finished, the room could seat 250 surgeons comfortably. But the college did not stop there. They needed something the mansion had never contained: an operating theater. The decision to build one was pragmatic. The college trained surgeons and promoted new techniques. Demonstrating those techniques required a space where visitors could observe procedures being performed on cadavers, or, occasionally, on living patients. Such spaces existed in hospitals, but the college wanted autonomy. They wanted their own theater, in their own building, under their own control. The architects chose the mansion's largest second-floor bedroom for conversion. The room measured 20 by 30 feet with 14-foot ceilings, providing adequate space for an operating table, instrument stands, seating for observers, and circulation for assistants. Windows on 2 walls offered natural light, critical for surgery before electric lighting became reliable. The location, tucked away from public spaces, provided privacy for procedures that might disturb visitors. Construction of the operating theater began in July 1917. Workers stripped the room to bare walls, removing every trace of its residential past. The floor was rebuilt with seamless tiles that could be scrubbed with antiseptic. The walls were covered in white enamel paint that reflected light and showed contamination. A large skylight was cut through the ceiling, flooding the room with northern light that did not shift as the sun moved. Gas lines were run to provide anesthesia. Drainage was installed to handle blood and other fluids. The operating table itself was state-of-the-art. Manufactured by American Sterilizer Company, it featured an adjustable height mechanism, tilting surfaces to improve surgical access, and trays for instruments. The table cost $1,200, equivalent to roughly $35,000 today. Surrounding it, the room held glass-fronted cabinets for instruments, wheeled carts for supplies, and tiered seating for observers who could watch procedures from above. When the renovation was complete in October 1917, the operating theater represented the cutting edge of surgical education. It was also a profound violation of everything Nickerson had intended. The room where he might have slept, where private moments unfolded, where vulnerability was expected and protected, had been transformed into a space designed for cutting into human flesh while strangers watched. The mansion had crossed a line it could never uncross. It was no longer a home. It was no longer even a former home being reused. It had become something entirely different, something that served the living by confronting mortality in the most direct way possible. The silk walls and chandeliers had been replaced by tile and bright light and the smell of carbolic acid. Preservationists were appalled. The mansion's transformation was complete desecration in their view, but the college saw it differently. They had saved the building from demolition. They had given it purpose. Most importantly, they had ensured its survival by making it useful. The first surgery in the new operating theater took place on November 3, 1917. The procedure was an appendectomy performed on a cadaver as a demonstration for visiting surgeons. 50 observers watched from the tiered seats as the surgeon made the initial incision, located the inflamed appendix, and removed it with practiced efficiency. The entire procedure lasted 47 minutes. When it finished, the observers applauded. The mansion had found its reason to live. It would survive by surrendering beauty for function, privacy for demonstration, and comfort for cutting. The house that Nickerson built to prove his permanence would endure by helping surgeons learn to cut away disease and death. The cost of that survival was everything the mansion had been built to be. Silk walls meet surgical steel where orchestras once played, surgeons now prepared to cut into living bodies. The American College of Surgeons officially opened its new headquarters on February 14, 1918. The building that had once hosted Valentine's Day balls now celebrated the holiday with a lecture on advances in abdominal surgery. The irony was noted in the Chicago Tribune, which ran a short piece describing the mansion's transformation from social palace to medical institution. The college moved quickly to establish the building's new identity. The library filled with medical journals and surgical textbooks. The offices housed administrators working to create standardized training requirements for surgeons. The assembly hall, once the ballroom, hosted monthly meetings where members presented case studies and debated techniques. The mansion had gone from hosting the wealthy to hosting the people who tried to keep the wealthy alive. The operating theater became the building's heart. Surgery in 1918 was undergoing a revolution. Antiseptic technique, pioneered by Joseph Lister decades earlier, had reduced infection rates dramatically. Anesthesia allowed procedures that would have been impossible when patients had to be conscious and restrained. X-rays provided glimpses inside the body without cutting. The operating theater at the College of Surgeons became a laboratory for testing and teaching these advances. The first living patient surgery took place in March 1918. The procedure was a hernia repair performed by Dr. Arthur Dean Bevan, one of the college's founding members. The patient was a 53-year-old laborer who had developed the hernia after years of heavy lifting. He could not afford hospital care, so the college offered to perform the surgery free in exchange for allowing observers. Bevan worked methodically. The patient was anesthetized with ether, administered through a mask by an assistant. The surgical site was scrubbed with carbolic acid solution, then draped with sterile cloth, leaving only a small window of exposed skin. Bevan made his incision with a scalpel, cutting through skin and subcutaneous fat to reach the weakened abdominal wall. Blood welled up. An assistant dabbed it away with gauze sponges. 20 observers watched from the tiered seats. They included surgeons from across the Midwest, men who had come to Chicago specifically to learn from Bevan. They took notes, asked questions, and observed every step of the procedure. This was the purpose of the operating theater, to transform knowledge that existed in one surgeon's hands into knowledge that could be shared and replicated. The hernia repair took 90 minutes. Bevan located the defect in the abdominal wall, pulled the protruding tissue back into place, and stitched the opening closed using catgut sutures that would dissolve as the tissue healed. He closed the skin with silk sutures that would be removed after 10 days. The patient woke up groggy, but stable. He spent one night in a recovery room the college had established in what had been the mansion's master bedroom, then was sent home with instructions for wound care. He recovered completely. No infection developed. The hernia did not recur. That success was not guaranteed. Infection killed roughly 10% of surgery patients, even with antiseptic technique. Anesthesia occasionally caused fatal reactions. Surgeons made mistakes, cutting arteries or damaging organs. Every operation was a calculated risk, a bet that the benefits of intervention outweighed the dangers of cutting into a living body. The operating theater saw dozens of procedures through 1918 and 1919. Gallbladder removals, tumor resections, amputations. Each surgery was documented in the college's records, including patient outcomes and complications. The records reveal a learning curve. Early procedures had higher complication rates. Infections occurred more frequently. But as techniques improved and standards were enforced, outcomes got better. The mansion itself seemed to participate in this evolution. The building's solid construction provided a stable environment. The thick limestone walls damped vibrations from street traffic that might disturb delicate procedures. The high ceilings allowed hot air to rise away from the operating field, keeping the temperature moderate. The mansion had been designed for permanence, and that permanence now served surgery. But the juxtaposition remained jarring. The operating theater occupied a room directly above the entrance hall, where Nickerson had greeted guests. Blood and antiseptic fumes drifted through air that had once carried perfume and cigar smoke. The carved woodwork that remained in the hallways framed doorways leading to rooms where human bodies were opened and repaired. The mansion had become a hybrid thing, part museum and part hospital, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. The college expanded the mansion's medical capabilities. In 1919, they installed an X-ray machine in the basement, allowing surgeons to examine patients before operating. The machine was enormous, weighing over 1,000 pounds and requiring special electrical wiring, but it transformed surgical planning. Doctors could locate tumors, identify fractures, and map anatomy before making the first incision. The mansion's basement, once used for storing coal and food, now housed technology that let surgeons see inside living bodies. The library grew to over 5,000 volumes by 1920. Medical knowledge was expanding rapidly. New journals appeared monthly. Textbooks were updated annually. The college maintained subscriptions to 70 international medical journals, and every issue was cataloged and shelved in what had been the mansion's dining room. Surgeons came from across the country to research techniques and review case studies. The assembly hall hosted increasingly ambitious demonstrations. In November 1920, Dr. John Benjamin Murphy performed a gastric resection, removing part of a patient's stomach to treat a bleeding ulcer. The procedure was experimental and dangerous. Murphy worked for 4 hours while 300 observers watched. The patient survived, validating the technique and establishing Murphy's reputation as one of America's most innovative surgeons. But success brought complications. The mansion was becoming too small for its mission. The college's membership had grown from 300 surgeons in 1913 to over 5,000 by 1921. Regional meetings attracted hundreds of attendees who could not fit in the assembly hall. The operating theater could only accommodate 20 seated observers, but demand for training slots far exceeded that number. The mansion had saved itself by being useful, but its usefulness was creating pressure for expansion. The college began planning additions to the building. An annex would be built on the western lawn, providing additional office space and a larger lecture hall. The mansion's original structure would be preserved, but it would be surrounded by modern construction. The pure Gilded Age palace would become the centerpiece of a larger medical campus. That plan met immediate resistance from preservationists. They argued that any addition would destroy the mansion's architectural integrity. The college countered that, without expansion, they would be forced to leave the building entirely and find a larger headquarters. The mansion would return to being empty and vulnerable to demolition. The debate was philosophical. Should a building be preserved exactly as built, even if that means it cannot serve modern needs? Or should preservation mean finding ways to keep a building useful, even if that requires change? The college's answer was pragmatic. They began construction on the annex in May 1922. The addition was designed to complement the mansion without mimicking it: red brick instead of limestone, modern angular lines instead of Romanesque curves. The contrast was deliberate. The annex announced itself as new, making clear what was original and what was added. The construction took 18 months. When completed in November 1923, the annex doubled the college's usable space. The mansion's rooms could now focus on leadership functions, the library, and ceremonial gatherings. The annex handled daily operations, expanding programs, and the flood of surgeons seeking training and accreditation. The operating theater remained in constant use. By 1924, it had hosted over 200 surgical procedures, most of them demonstrations for educational purposes. The room had developed a reputation. Surgeons spoke of the Nickerson operating theater with respect bordering on reverence. Important advances had been demonstrated there. Critical techniques had been refined there. The room where a banker once might have slept had become a classroom for learning how to save lives. But the room retained traces of its past. The original windows remained, though covered with blinds to control light. The door frames still showed their carved rosettes. The ceiling, though painted white, retained its ornate plasterwork. These fragments were not preserved out of sentiment. They were simply too expensive to remove. The mansion's solidity meant its bones resisted alteration. At night, when the building emptied and the lights went dark, the operating theater stood silent. The table waited. The instruments rested in their cabinets. The tiered seats curved upward toward the skylight. And sometimes, according to night watchmen, the room felt wrong. Too cold in summer, too still in winter. They reported sounds that might have been settling or might have been something else. Footsteps in empty hallways, whispers that stopped when investigated. The college ignored such reports. Buildings made noise. Old buildings made more noise. There was no mystery, only imagination filling silence. But the operating theater had hosted suffering. It had seen blood and fear and flesh exposed to air and light. It had contained moments where the boundary between life and death blurred to a knife's edge. Those moments leave marks that have nothing to do with rational explanation. The mansion had become a place where healing and history intersected. What happened next would test which force was stronger: genius, blood, and experimentation. Some of modern medicine's breakthroughs unfolded beneath ceilings designed for wealth, not healing. Dr. Franklin Martin had a theory about cancer. In the early 1920s, oncology was primitive. Doctors understood that cancer involved uncontrolled cell growth, but they did not know what caused it or how to stop it beyond cutting tumors out and hoping for the best. Martin believed that early detection combined with aggressive surgery could dramatically improve survival rates. He used the operating theater to test that theory. The procedures were brutal by modern standards. Martin operated on patients with abdominal cancers, removing not just the visible tumor, but surrounding tissue, nearby lymph nodes, and sometimes entire organs. The surgeries lasted 6 to 8 hours. Blood loss was severe. Recovery was agonizing. But some patients survived when they would have died otherwise. Those successes validated Martin's aggressive approach and influenced surgical oncology for decades. The college's records document 53 cancer surgeries performed in the operating theater between 1922 and 1928. 31 patients survived at least 5 years after their procedures. That was a survival rate of 58%, extraordinary for an era when cancer was generally considered a death sentence. The operating theater had become a laboratory for extending life. But the work came with ethical complications. Many of the patients were poor. They could not afford hospital care, so they accepted free treatment at the college in exchange for allowing their surgeries to be observed and documented. Some procedures were experimental, testing techniques that had never been attempted. The patients understood this, but desperation limited their choices. They faced certain death from cancer or uncertain death from surgery. Most chose the knife. The college maintained that this was ethical. The patients received care they could not otherwise access. Medical knowledge advanced. Future patients benefited from techniques proven in the operating theater. But the power dynamic was undeniable. The surgeons held all the authority. The patients provided their bodies and their suffering in exchange for a chance at survival. The operating theater also hosted research that pushed boundaries in other ways. In 1924, Dr. George Cryle performed a series of thyroidectomies, removing overactive thyroid glands to treat hyperthyroidism. The procedures were technically demanding. The thyroid sits near the trachea and major blood vessels. One wrong cut could cause fatal bleeding or permanent nerve damage affecting the patient's voice. Cryle developed a technique using careful dissection and meticulous control of bleeding. He performed 18 thyroidectomies in the operating theater over 6 months, documenting each step with photographs and detailed notes. Observers came from across the world to watch him work. The technique he refined became standard practice and is still taught in modified form today. The mansion had become a crucible for innovation. The operating theater's combination of natural light, good sightlines for observers, and the college's willingness to attempt new procedures created ideal conditions for surgical advancement. But those conditions also created opportunities for experimentation that would not be permitted under modern ethical standards. One controversial series involved radium treatment for cancer. In the mid-1920s, radioactive materials were thought to have curative properties. Doctors implanted radium pellets directly into tumors, hoping the radiation would kill cancer cells. The treatment sometimes worked. More often, it caused radiation burns, tissue necrosis, and agonizing deaths. The college performed radium implantations in the operating theater throughout 1926 and 1927. The procedures were simple. A surgeon made a small incision, inserted the radium pellet using forceps, and sutured the wound closed. Patients were told the treatment was experimental but potentially curative. Most were desperate enough to try anything. The results were mixed at best. Some tumors shrank. Many patients died from radiation poisoning before the cancer could kill them. The college eventually discontinued radium treatment, but not before dozens of patients had been exposed. The operating theater, designed to save lives, had also hosted suffering caused by well-intentioned ignorance. These contradictions troubled no one at the time. Medical ethics in the 1920s assumed that doctors knew best and patients should trust their judgment. Informed consent barely existed as a concept. Patients signed forms acknowledging they understood surgery was dangerous, but those forms did not detail specific risks or alternative treatments. The power to decide rested entirely with the surgeon. The mansion witnessed this dynamic play out repeatedly. In the entrance hall, surgeons greeted patients with confidence and authority. In the operating theater, those same surgeons cut into bodies while students watched and learned. The building facilitated both care and education, but it also enabled a paternalism that modern medicine has largely rejected. Yet the work was undeniably important. The techniques developed in the operating theater saved countless lives. The training provided their elevated surgical standards across the country. The college's insistence on proper credentials helped eliminate unqualified practitioners who had done tremendous harm. The mansion had become an engine for medical progress, and progress requires sacrifice. The night watchman's reports of strange occurrences increased during this period. They described cold spots in the operating theater that defied explanation, instruments that moved between rounds, shadows that crossed windows when no one was present. The reports were consistent enough that the college investigated, hiring an engineer to check for drafts, settling, or other physical causes. The engineer found nothing unusual. The building's heating system worked properly. The floors and walls showed no structural issues. The windows were secure. His report concluded that the watchmen were experiencing normal phenomena exaggerated by imagination and the building's reputation. But the watchmen knew what they experienced. They described a presence in the operating theater, something that watched and waited. They refused to enter the room alone after dark. Several quit rather than continue night shifts. The college responded by adjusting patrol routes to ensure watchmen always worked in pairs. The rational explanation was obvious. The operating theater had hosted suffering and death. The watchmen knew this. Their imaginations filled the darkness with ghosts born from knowledge and anxiety. There was no mystery, only the human tendency to personify the unknown. But rational explanations do not account for everything. In 1928, a surgeon named Robert Morris performed an emergency appendectomy in the operating theater. The patient was a 16-year-old girl whose appendix had ruptured. She was septic, delirious with fever, and likely to die within hours if the infected organ was not removed. Morris worked quickly. He opened the abdomen, located the ruptured appendix, and removed it. The infection had spread throughout the abdominal cavity. He irrigated with saline, trying to wash away the bacteria and pus. The procedure took 3 hours. When he finished, the girl's chances of survival were perhaps 50%. She died 2 days later. Sepsis overwhelmed her body despite Morris's best efforts. Morris was devastated. He had done everything correctly, but skill was not always enough. That night, he returned to the operating theater alone, trying to understand what he might have done differently. The building was dark and quiet. He sat in the tiered seats where observers normally watched, staring at the empty table. He later told colleagues that he felt someone else in the room, not threatening, but present, watching with him. The sensation was so strong that he turned on the lights and searched the entire theater. No one was there. Morris never spoke publicly about that experience, but he mentioned it privately to friends. He did not claim to believe in ghosts. He simply acknowledged that something in the operating theater felt different from anywhere else in the mansion. The room held weight that had nothing to do with its physical structure. By 1930, the operating theater had hosted over 400 surgical procedures. The room had seen triumph and tragedy, innovation and suffering, life extended and life ended despite the best efforts of skilled surgeons. That history had soaked into the walls, the floors, the very air. Whether that created ghosts or simply emotional resonance was a question without a definitive answer. What was certain was that the mansion had fully transformed. It had gone from monument to tool. Its purpose was no longer to impress, but to serve. And in serving, it had become something its builder never imagined, a place where mortality was confronted directly, where the fragility of human life met the determination of human skill. The house had survived by accepting blood where there had been champagne. That acceptance was total and irreversible. The mansion could never return to being simply beautiful. It had become useful, and usefulness is written in scars. Usefulness becomes immortality. As Prairie Avenue emptied, the mansion survived by being indispensable rather than admired. The Great Depression arrived in October 1929. The stock market collapsed. Banks failed. Unemployment reached 25%. Chicago's economy, still recovering from earlier panics, was devastated. Construction stopped. Businesses closed. The wealthy saw their fortunes evaporate overnight, and the poor faced starvation. Prairie Avenue accelerated its decline. The remaining mansions, already struggling with maintenance costs, became impossible to sustain. Owners who had clung to their palaces through the 1920s finally surrendered. The houses went to auction, sold for fractions of their construction costs, or were simply abandoned when no buyers appeared. The demolitions came quickly. The Kimball Mansion fell in 1930. The Eldridge Mansion followed in 1931. By 1933, over half of Prairie Avenue's grand estates had been torn down. The lots were sold to developers who built cheap apartment buildings or left them vacant, waiting for the economy to recover enough to make construction viable. The Nickerson Mansion survived because it was useful. The American College of Surgeons continued operating throughout the Depression. Membership declined slightly as physicians struggled financially, but the organization's core mission remained essential. Surgeons still needed training. Standards still needed enforcement. The college's work was counter-cyclical. When times were desperate, people still got sick, still suffered injuries, still required surgery. The mansion's operating theater stayed busy. The college's financial position was stronger than most institutions. Membership fees provided steady income. The building was paid for, eliminating mortgage costs. Operating expenses were modest compared to the mansion's peak years under Nickerson. The college spent roughly $12,000 annually on heat, electricity, maintenance, and staff salaries. That was manageable even as the economy collapsed around them. But the mansion required ongoing investment. In 1931, the roof developed serious leaks. Slate tiles that had lasted 50 years were failing. Water damage threatened the ballroom ceiling and several second-floor rooms. The college faced a choice: spend $6,000 on a new roof or watch the building deteriorate. They spent the money, not out of sentiment, but necessity. The mansion housed their headquarters, their library, their operating theater, and their institutional identity. Allowing it to decay was not an option. The college needed the building, so the building got what it needed to survive. That logic protected the mansion when every neighboring palace fell. The Kimball Mansion had been empty when demolished. The Eldridge Mansion had been divided into apartments that generated minimal income. The Field Mansion had been sold to a developer who saw more value in the land than the structure. None of these buildings were necessary. The Nickerson Mansion was necessary. The operating theater hosted 230 surgical procedures during the Depression years of 1930 to 1937. That was fewer than during the 1920s, but still substantial. Many patients were charity cases, people who could not afford hospital care but desperately needed surgery. The college treated them for free. using their cases for training and research. The mansion, built to showcase wealth, had become a place where wealth's absence did not prevent healing. The library continued growing. By 1935, it held over 8,000 volumes and subscriptions to 140 medical journals. Surgeons traveled to Chicago specifically to access resources unavailable elsewhere. The mansion's carved woodwork and limestone walls formed the backdrop for research that advanced surgical practice across the country. The building's beauty was incidental, but its utility was absolute. Prairie Avenue around the mansion transformed into something unrecognizable. Empty lots filled with weeds. Apartment buildings rose where mansions had stood. The street's character shifted from exclusive residential to mixed-use commercial. Traffic increased. Noise increased. The trees that had once lined the avenue were cut down to widen the roadway. The urban fabric that had supported Millionaire's row unraveled completely. The mansion stood amid this chaos like a survivor from another era. Its limestone facade remained immaculate, maintained by the college's careful stewardship. The yard, though reduced in size by street widening, still provided a buffer from the surrounding chaos. Passers-by who remembered Prairie Avenue's peak years stopped and stared, confronted by this relic of a vanished world. But the mansion was not a relic. It was a working building serving a modern purpose. That distinction mattered. Museums preserve dead things. The mansion contained living work. Surgeons used its spaces daily. Patients recovered in its rooms. Medical knowledge expanded within its walls. The building had transcended nostalgia by remaining essential. The college formalized this philosophy in 1936 when they published a history of their first 20 years in the mansion. The book included architectural drawings, photographs, and a detailed account of how the building had been adapted for medical use. The final chapter addressed the question of preservation. The college's position was clear. They valued the mansion's history, but prioritized its function. Changes would be made when necessary to serve the college's mission. Original features would be preserved where possible, but usefulness would always take precedence over authenticity. The building survived because it worked, and it would continue working even if that meant further alterations. This stance horrified architectural purists. They argued the college was destroying a landmark through incremental changes. Every modification erased another piece of the building's original character. Eventually, nothing authentic would remain. The college's response was pragmatic. Without their occupation, the mansion would have been demolished decades earlier. Preservation in amber was not an option. The choice was between a living building that changed or a dead building that was torn down. They had chosen life. By 1940, the mansion had outlived every other grand estate on Prairie Avenue. It stood alone, surrounded by the 20th century, sustained by its transformation into something Nickerson never intended. The bank president who built the house to prove his permanence had succeeded, but only because the house abandoned his vision. The operating theater continued hosting procedures through World War II. Surgical techniques advanced rapidly during the war as doctors dealt with combat injuries. Many of those advances were demonstrated and taught in the mansion's converted bedroom. The room that had once represented domestic privacy now served as a classroom for wartime medicine. The college expanded again in 1947, building a second annex on the eastern side of the property. The new construction consumed the last of the mansion's original grounds. The house was now completely surrounded by modern buildings, connected to them by corridors and shared mechanical systems. The original structure remained visible, but it was no longer independent. It had been absorbed into a larger complex. That absorption was literal and metaphorical. The mansion no longer stood apart from the 20th century. It was integrated into modern systems, modern purposes, modern needs. The transformation was total. Every room had been repurposed. Every space served a function unrelated to its original design. The mansion had survived, but survival meant becoming unrecognizable. Only the exterior preserved the illusion. From the street, the mansion still looked like a Gilded Age palace. The limestone facade showed no hint of the operating theater behind its walls. The windows still suggested drawing rooms and ballrooms rather than offices and conference halls. The building performed its past even as it functioned entirely in the present. That performance was its final compromise. The mansion would maintain appearances for the world while surrendering everything internally. Beauty would be preserved as a shell protecting usefulness within. The house had learned that survival required flexibility, that permanence was achieved through constant adaptation, that what endures is not what remains unchanged, but what remains relevant. By 1950, the mansion had stood for 67 years. It had outlasted its builder, his wealth, his social class, and the city that class had built. It survived not through strength, but through surrender, not through resisting change, but through embracing transformation. The house proved that immortality is not about remaining the same. It is about remaining necessary. The lonely survivor on Prairie Avenue. By the mid-20th century, this mansion stood alone, surrounded by absence. The demolition statistics were brutal. In 1900, Prairie Avenue held 47 grand mansions, each one representing at least $100,000 in construction costs and a family's claim to prominence. By 1960, only 3 remained standing. Of those 3, 2 had been converted to commercial use and stripped of most architectural details. The Nickerson Mansion was the only one that retained its exterior integrity and any connection to its original purpose. The destruction happened in waves. The Depression took 15 mansions. Urban renewal in the 1950s claimed another 20. The remaining buildings were demolished piecemeal through the 60s and 70s, as land values made preservation economically irrational. Each demolition lasted a few days. Wrecking crews arrived, knocked down the walls, hauled away the rubble, and left an empty lot that quickly filled with parking or cheap construction. The city did not mourn these losses. Chicago was looking forward, not backward. The old mansions represented a past most people wanted to forget. They were monuments to inequality, built by men who had exploited workers and cornered markets. Their destruction felt like progress, clearing away the physical residue of Gilded Age excess to make room for modern egalitarian development. But something was lost in that clearing. The mansions had been works of art, regardless of their builders' moral failings. They represented craftsmanship and ambition that could not be replicated. The carved stonework, the imported woods, the architectural innovation, all of it required resources and patience that modern construction economics made impossible. When the mansions fell, they took knowledge and beauty with them. The Nickerson Mansion survived because the American College of Surgeons refused to leave. By the 1950s, the building was outdated. The operating theater had been superseded by modern hospital facilities with better equipment and more space. The library was valuable, but could have been relocated. The offices were cramped compared to newer buildings. Every practical argument suggested the college should sell the mansion and build a modern headquarters. They chose to stay. Partly, this was institutional inertia. The The college had invested decades and substantial capital into adapting the mansion. Starting over somewhere else would be expensive and disruptive. But the decision was also emotional. The mansion had become part of the college's identity. Leaving it felt like abandoning their history, so they renovated instead of relocating. In 1956, the college installed air conditioning throughout the building, drilling through thick limestone walls to run ductwork. In 1961, they upgraded the electrical system to handle computers and modern office equipment. Each improvement required careful work to avoid damaging the mansion's historical fabric. The college walked a constant line between preservation and modernization. The operating theater closed permanently in 1963. Modern surgical standards required facilities that the mansion could not provide. The room was converted to archival storage, housing the college's historical records and medical artifacts. The operating table was donated to a medical museum. The tiered seats remained, now empty of observers, facing shelves of documents rather than a surgical field. But the room retained its weight. Staff members working alone in the archives reported the same sensations night watchmen had described decades earlier. Cold spots, unexplained sounds, the feeling of being watched. The college's official position was that these were subjective experiences without empirical basis. Unoffically, few people wanted to work in that room after dark. Prairie Avenue changed around the mansion through the 60s and 70s. The street that had once been residential became industrial. Warehouses and factories replaced the demolished mansions. Truck traffic increased. The area grew rough, unsafe, increasingly abandoned as manufacturing declined. The mansion stood incongruous, a limestone palace amid decay. The college considered relocating during this period. The neighborhood's deterioration made the building feel isolated and vulnerable. But moving would require substantial capital, and the college's finances were tight. Medical education had changed. Hospital residency programs had largely replaced the college's training functions. Membership was declining. The institution faced pressure from multiple directions. The mansion, ironically, became an asset. Its historical significance attracted attention from preservationists who had previously condemned the college's alterations. In 1972, the building was designated a Chicago landmark, providing legal protection against demolition and some tax benefits for maintenance. The designation recognized both the mansion's architectural importance and the college's role in preserving it. But landmark status did not solve the fundamental problem. The mansion required constant, expensive maintenance to remain functional. The limestone facade needed regular cleaning and repair. The roof required replacement every 30 years. The mechanical systems were aging and inefficient. The college spent over $50,000 annually on upkeep, equivalent to roughly $350,000 today. The building had become a burden its owner could barely afford but could not abandon. The mansion had survived by being useful, but its usefulness was declining. The college no longer performed surgeries there. The library was valuable but could be digital. The offices were cramped and outdated. The mansion's survival had always depended on serving a purpose that justified its costs. When that purpose eroded, survival became uncertain. The 1980s brought a partial solution. Chicago's historic preservation movement gained strength. Developers began seeing value in adaptive reuse of old buildings rather than demolition. The South Loop, which included Prairie Avenue, was targeted for residential redevelopment. The mansion's location, once a liability, became an asset. Historic buildings attracted the kind of urban professionals developers wanted to lure back to the city. The college partnered with the city to stabilize the area around the mansion. Street improvements, better lighting, and new residential construction made the neighborhood safer and more attractive. The mansion benefited from this investment without contributing much financially. The building's presence provided historical credibility that developers leveraged to market new condominiums and renovated loft spaces. By 1990, Prairie Avenue was gentrifying. The warehouses became artist studios and apartments. Coffee shops and restaurants appeared. Young professionals moved in, attracted by proximity to downtown and relatively affordable housing. The mansion found itself at the center of a renewed neighborhood, no longer isolated, but integrated into an urban revival. The college responded by opening parts of the mansion to public tours. The first-floor rooms were restored to approximate their 1880s appearance, using period furniture and reproductions of the original wallpaper and fixtures. Visitors could walk through the entrance hall, the drawing room, and the library, experiencing a carefully curated version of Gilded Age domestic life. The operating theater remained off-limits to tourists. The college maintained it as archive storage, but the room's history was referenced in tour narratives. Guides described how the mansion had been adapted for medical use, how the ballroom had hosted surgical conferences, how the bedroom had become an operating theater where important advances were demonstrated. The tours generated modest revenue and renewed interest in the mansion's history. Articles appeared in Chicago magazines and newspapers, telling the story of Prairie Avenue's lone survivor. Television documentaries featured the building as an example of successful adaptive reuse. The mansion's value shifted from purely functional to partly symbolic. It represented possibility, proof that historic buildings could survive if given new purpose. But the survival remained fragile. The college's financial situation had not improved. Operating the mansion cost over $100,000 annually by the mid-90s. Tour revenue covered perhaps 20% of that. The rest came from the college's general funds, which were stretched thin by other commitments. The mansion survived year to year, always one budget crisis away from forced sale or even demolition, despite its landmark status. The house had outlived its builder by 90 years. It had outlasted Prairie Avenue's wealth and glory. It had survived fires, depressions, wars, and urban renewal. But survival was not the same as security. The mansion's future remained uncertain, dependent on forces beyond its control, threatened by economics and indifference, and the simple fact that usefulness is temporary while costs are permanent. Preservation through purpose. Survival demanded constant compromise, even as preservationists argued over what was lost. The American College of Surgeons sold the mansion in 1963. The decision was pragmatic. The college was relocating its headquarters to a modern office building that better served their needs. The mansion had become more burden than asset. They sold to the city of Chicago for $1, transferring both the building and responsibility for its preservation. The city did not want another museum. Chicago already operated dozens of cultural institutions competing for limited public funding. The mansion needed a tenant willing to maintain the building while allowing public access. The solution arrived from an unexpected direction. The Richard H. Driehaus Museum took over the mansion in 2003, 40 years after the city acquired it. Driehaus was a financier and philanthropist with a passion for Gilded Age architecture and decorative arts. He had the resources and motivation to restore the mansion to something approximating its original appearance. More importantly, he understood that preservation required accepting changes while respecting history. The restoration took 5 years and cost over $10 million. Workers stripped away layers of institutional modifications, removing dropped ceilings, carpet tiles, and partition walls. They uncovered the original plaster, repaired damaged woodwork, and recreated decorative elements that had been removed or destroyed. The ballroom regained its silk walls and chandeliers. The drawing room was furnished with period-appropriate antiques. The entrance hall gleamed with restored marble and polished wood. But the restoration was not pure replication. Modern systems had to be integrated. Climate control was essential to preserve the building and make it comfortable for visitors. Electrical and plumbing upgrades were necessary for safety and code compliance. Accessibility features, including an elevator and restrooms, were added to accommodate disabled visitors. These changes were carefully designed to minimize visual impact while ensuring the building could function as a modern museum. The operating theater presented a particular challenge. Should it be restored to its appearance as a surgical space or return to its original function as a bedroom? The museum chose a middle path. The room was restored to suggest its medical use while acknowledging its domestic origins. Displays explain the space's transformation, showing photographs from the surgical era alongside descriptions of what the room might have contained when Nickerson lived there. This approach satisfied neither purists nor modernists completely. Architectural historians argued the restoration went too far, creating a fantasy version of the mansion that never actually existed. The furniture was appropriate to the period, but had never been in the building. The color schemes were researched but speculative. The museum had created a beautiful stage set rather than an authentic historical space. The museum's response was that perfect authenticity was impossible. The mansion had been thoroughly altered during its 80 years as the College of Surgeons' headquarters. Many original features were gone forever. The choice was between creating a plausible evocation of the Gilded Age or leaving the building as a modified institutional space that reflected neither its origins nor its adaptation. They chose the former. The museum opened to the public in 2008. Attendance was modest initially, around 15,000 visitors per year. The mansion was competing for tourists with larger, better-known museums. Its location on Prairie Avenue, though improved from the 1980s, was still not a major destination. The museum needed to build an audience through programming, special events, and word of mouth. They succeeded gradually. By 2015, annual attendance had reached 40,000. The mansion attracted architecture enthusiasts, history buffs, and tourists looking for something distinctive. The tours emphasized the building's transformation, telling both the story of Nickerson's ambition and the college's pragmatic adaptation. Visitors learned about Gilded Age excess and early 20th century surgery, about preservation and compromise, about survival through reinvention. The costs of operating the museum were substantial. Climate control alone consumed over $60,000 annually. Staff salaries, insurance, utilities, and ongoing maintenance totaled another $400,000. The Dry House Foundation covered these expenses, understanding that the mansion would never be self-supporting. The building was a public good, an educational resource, a piece of Chicago's history, preserved for future generations. But preservation raised philosophical questions without clear answers. Was the mansion being preserved or performed? The restoration created rooms that looked historically accurate but functioned as modern museum galleries. Visitors experienced a curated version of the past, edited and staged for maximum effect. The silk walls were reproductions. The furniture was borrowed from other collections. Even the colors were educated guesses based on paint analysis and period sources. The mansion had become a representation of itself. The building endured, but what it represented kept shifting. To Nickerson, it was proof of permanence. To the College of Surgeons, it was useful space. To the museum, it was an artifact illustrating Gilded Age culture. Each version was legitimate, but each also erased something that came before. The debate over authenticity intensified in 2012 when the museum proposed adding a visitor center in the remaining yard space. The structure would provide needed amenities, ticket sales, restrooms, and a small gift shop, all functions that could not be accommodated within the mansion without damaging its historical fabric. But construction would consume the last remnant of the original grounds and permanently alter the mansion's setting. Preservationists divided. Some argued any addition was unacceptable. The mansion's survival had already required too many compromises. Others countered that without modern amenities, the building could not function as a public museum, and non-functional historic buildings were demolished. The visitor center was necessary for the mansion's continued survival. The addition was built in 2014. It was deliberately modern in design, making clear what was new and what was original. The structure used glass and steel to contrast with the mansion's limestone. Visitors entered through the new building before crossing into the historic spaces, creating a clear transition between present and past. The result was controversial but functional. The mansion could now accommodate larger groups, school tours, and special events that generated revenue and public engagement. Attendance increased to over 50,000 per year. The building's survival was secured for another generation. But secured at what cost? The mansion Nickerson built no longer existed in pure form. It had been adapted, modified, restored, and staged. The house was physically present, but historically distant. Visitors could walk through the rooms and touch the woodwork, but they were experiencing a carefully constructed narrative about the past rather than the past itself. This is the paradox of preservation. Buildings are physical objects existing in time. To preserve them is to freeze them artificially, to halt the natural processes of change and decay. But that freezing requires constant intervention, constant expense, constant decisions about what to save and what to surrender. Perfect preservation is impossible. Something is always lost. The mansion survives because people keep deciding it deserves to survive. That decision is renewed annually when the Dry House Foundation allocates funds for operations and maintenance. It is renewed each time the museum staff chooses which parts of the building's history to emphasize in tours and exhibits. It is renewed by the thousands of visitors who pay admission, validating the decision to keep the doors open. But the decision could change. Foundations shift priorities. Public interest wanes. Buildings require increasing investment as they age. The mansion is 140 years old. Its systems are wearing out. The limestone facade needs continuous care. Climate change is accelerating freeze-thaw cycles that damage stone. The costs of preservation rise every year. The mansion's survival is not guaranteed. It is contingent, provisional, dependent on maintaining the fragile balance between cost and value, between historical significance and practical utility. The building has survived by being useful, but usefulness is contextual. What seems essential today may appear expendable tomorrow. That uncertainty is the price of permanence. Nothing lasts without effort. The mansion endures because people work to make it endure. When that work stops, the building will fall, not immediately, but inevitably. Survival is active, not passive. It requires constant renewal, constant adaptation, constant compromise. The mansion has always understood this. From the moment surgeons first walked into the ballroom carrying their instruments, the house has accepted change as the cost of existence. It has surrendered beauty for function, authenticity for utility, purity for survival. Those surrenders are written into every wall, carved into every panel, embedded in the very stone. The question is not whether the mansion will survive. The question is what it will have to become next. What endures when beauty fails. After 140 years, the mansion forces an uncomfortable question about what deserves to last. Prairie Avenue is quiet now. The truck traffic that dominated the street in the 70s has moved elsewhere. The warehouses have become expensive lofts. The empty lots have filled with townhouses, priced beyond what most Chicago residents can afford. The neighborhood is wealthy again, though the wealth is distributed differently than in Nickerson's era. Instead of 47 families and 47 mansions, thousands of residents occupy hundreds of units in buildings that maximize density and minimize grandeur. The Nickerson Mansion sits amid this transformation like a monument to different values. Its thick walls, high ceilings, and extravagant spaces represent an approach to living that modern economics makes impossible. No one builds mansions like this anymore. The cost would be measured in tens of millions. The operating expenses would exceed what all but the wealthiest could sustain. The mansion survives not because its model was successful, but because it failed so completely that what remains has become rare. Scarcity creates value. The mansion matters partly because so few like it still exist. If Prairie Avenue had retained all 47 estates, each one would be less significant. Their collective survival would normalize Gilded Age architecture, making any individual building less precious. But because 44 fell and only 3 remain, each survivor carries the weight of everything that was lost. This is an uncomfortable truth. The mansion's importance increases with every demolition. It benefits from the destruction of its peers. The building's cultural significance is built on absence, on the fact that most of its contemporaries are gone. Preservation is competitive. What survives matters because so much did not. The operating theater embodies this competition. The room survives because the American College of Surgeons gave it purpose. If the college had demolished the mansion or allowed it to deteriorate, the operating theater would be gone. But the college's intervention was destructive. They gutted a bedroom, stripped away its domestic character, and transformed it into something unrecognizable. The room survived by ceasing to be itself. Was that preservation? The physical space endured, but its meaning changed completely. A room designed for sleep, and privacy became a room designed for cutting and observation. The transformation was total. Only the walls and windows remained constant. Everything else was replaced, reimagined, repurposed. Yet without that transformation, the room would not exist. The mansion would have been demolished in the 1920s or 30s. The bedroom would have been torn apart and hauled to a landfill. The operating theater preserved the physical space, even as it destroyed the original purpose. Both things are true simultaneously. Preservation and destruction are not opposites, but partners in the process of survival. The mansion story reveals that permanence is a negotiation. Buildings last by accepting changes that would horrify their creators. Nickerson built his palace to stand unchanged for 1,000 years. It has lasted 140 years by changing constantly. The house survived by surrendering the very qualities Nickerson thought made it worth preserving: This pattern repeats across architectural history. The Pantheon in Rome survived because it was converted to a church. The Hagia Sophia endured by becoming a mosque, then a museum, then a mosque again. Buildings that resist adaptation get demolished. Buildings that accept transformation survive, but what survives is often barely recognizable as what was built. The mansion asks us to consider what we mean by survival. Is a building that has been completely repurposed still the same building? If every room has been altered, every system replaced, every purpose reimagined, what makes it the house Nickerson built? Only the limestone walls and carved wood remain from the original construction. Everything else is reconstruction, restoration, or replacement. Perhaps survival is less about preserving specific materials and more about maintaining continuity. The mansion has stood on the same site for 140 years. It has housed continuous human activity across 3 centuries. The building has adapted to each era's needs while retaining enough of its form to remain recognizable. That continuity might matter more than authenticity, but continuity requires surrender. The mansion could not remain a private residence and survive. The economics had collapsed. The social structure that supported such houses had dissolved. The building had to become something else or cease to exist. It chose transformation, accepting an operating theater where there had been a bedroom, accepting offices where there had been drawing rooms, accepting tourists where there had been family. Those acceptances were not noble. They were desperate. The mansion transformed because the alternative was demolition. But desperation does not diminish achievement. The building found a way to remain relevant across 14 decades of economic, social, and technological upheaval. That required flexibility most buildings lack. Most structures are demolished because they cannot adapt. The mansion survived because it could. The current museum incarnation represents the latest adaptation. The building is no longer a hospital headquarters. It is a public educational space, generating cultural value rather than medical advancement. The transformation required another round of gutting and rebuilding, another surrender of one purpose in favor of another. The pattern continues. What comes next is uncertain. Museums face their own economic pressures. Attendance fluctuates. Funding sources shift. The mansion's survival depends on the Dry House Foundation's continued support, which depends on factors beyond anyone's control. The building is one institutional priority shift away from facing another crisis, but the mansion has faced crises before. It survived the panic of 1893, the Great Depression, urban renewal, and decades of neglect. Each time it found a new reason to exist. The building has proven remarkably resilient, not through strength but through flexibility. It bends rather than breaks. That flexibility is the mansion's true legacy. Nickerson built the house to prove that wealth could create permanence. He was wrong. Wealth created only temporary stability. What created permanence was the building's capacity to become something other than what was intended. The mansion outlived every assumption Nickerson made about it. The house proved more adaptable than its creator could imagine. This should comfort us. We build for purposes that become obsolete. We create structures designed for needs that shift. Everything we construct will eventually require repurposing or face destruction. The mansion demonstrates that buildings are not sacred objects that must be preserved exactly as built. They are tools that can serve multiple purposes across time if we allow them to change. But this also challenges us. If survival requires transformation, what are we preserving? The mansion's physical form remains, but its meaning has been rewritten repeatedly. The building serves as evidence of Gilded Age architecture, early 20th century surgery, and contemporary museum practices. It contains multiple histories layered over each other. Which one is the mansion's true story? All of them. The building accumulated meaning rather than replacing it. Each era added another layer. The mansion is simultaneously a banker's palace, a surgical theater, and a museum. Those identities coexist within the same walls. The building's richness comes from that accumulation, from the fact that it has been many things rather than only one thing. This is what endures when beauty fails. Not the original vision preserved in perfect stasis, but the building's capacity to absorb new purposes while maintaining enough of its form to remain coherent. The mansion survives because it tells multiple stories, because it means different things to different people, because it has been useful in different ways across different eras. The house on Prairie Avenue stands as proof that permanence is earned through adaptation. Nickerson's fortune could not preserve the building. The limestone walls could not preserve it. What preserved it was the mansion's willingness to become whatever was needed to remain relevant. That willingness required surrendering beauty, comfort, authenticity, and identity. The price was high, but the alternative was erasure. After 140 years, the mansion endures not because it was built well, though it was. Not because it was beautiful, though it is. It endures because it learned the lesson Nickerson never could. Nothing lasts by refusing to change. Survival requires transformation. Permanence is achieved not through resistance, but through surrender. The question the mansion leaves us is simple and profound. What are we building that we believe will last? And what will those structures have to become to survive us?